In 1958, they found the Dahl family of Appalachia, and what they said rewrote history. In eastern Kentucky's foggy hollows, where the mountains fold over themselves like ancient secrets, a team of medical researchers stumbled upon something that would haunt American genetic science for decades. They called them the Dahl family, not because anyone remembered their real surname, but because of what generations of isolation had done to their features. Their faces were small, delicate, almost porcelain, with eyes that seemed too large for their heads and limbs that appeared frozen in childhood proportions. What the doctors discovered in those remote cabins would challenge everything science thought it knew about human heredity and force America to confront the hidden cost of its forgotten communities. It was 1958, and Dr. Marcus Whitfield had spent 3 weeks navigating the treacherous dirt roads of Letcher County, Kentucky. His government-issued sedan had already lost a muffler to an unseen pothole, and his patience was wearing thin against the October chill creeping through the vehicle's failing heater. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You won't want to miss our exclusive investigations into America's darkest family secrets that mainstream media refuses to cover. Hit subscribe now to join our community of truth seekers. But the reports on his desk in Louisville demanded investigation. Local health workers had described a family unlike any they had encountered in decades of service to these remote mountain communities. They spoke of adults who looked like children, of speech patterns that seemed to belong to another century, of a family tree that, when sketched, looked less like branches spreading outward and more like a circle folding endlessly back upon itself. Whitfield was a geneticist by training, a man who had spent the better part of the 1940s studying inherited conditions at Johns Hopkins before the war redirected his expertise toward government health initiatives. Now at 53, he found himself representing the Kentucky Department of Health on what his superiors called a reconnaissance mission into one of the most isolated pockets of American civilization. The Appalachian Mountains had long served as a fortress against the outside world, preserving customs, dialects, and, as Whitfield would soon discover, genetic lineages that the rest of America had long since diversified beyond recognition. The hollow where the Dahl family resided had no official name on any government map. Locals called it Pigeon Creek, though there had been no pigeons there for as long as anyone could remember. To reach it required abandoning the main road entirely and following a creek bed that served as both water source and pathway for the 7 households clinging to the mountainside like stubborn moss. The cabins were constructed of hand-hewn logs, some dating back to before the Civil War, their chinking crumbling in places to reveal the darkness within. Smoke rose from stone chimneys carrying the scent of burning oak and something else, something vaguely medicinal that Whitfield would later learn was the family's homemade remedy for the persistent respiratory ailments that plagued their bloodline. His first encounter with a member of the Dahl family came not through formal introduction, but through the startled eyes of a figure he initially mistook for a child playing near the creek. The person stood perhaps 4 feet tall, dressed in overalls patched so many times the original fabric was barely visible. Whitfield called out a greeting, but the figure simply stared, those oversized eyes blinking slowly, as if processing the sight of a stranger required extraordinary effort. When the figure finally spoke, the voice that emerged was deep, resonant, unmistakably that of an adult man. "You the doctor they said was coming." The words carried an accent so thick that Whitfield had to replay them in his mind before comprehension arrived. "I am Dr. Marcus Whitfield from Louisville. I was hoping to speak with the family elders." The small man, for that is what he was despite all appearances to the contrary, tilted his head in a gesture that seemed almost bird-like. His name, he said, was Ezra, and he was 37 years old, though he appeared no older than a child of 10 or 11. He had never left this hollow in his entire life. Had never seen a city or a paved road or an automobile until the county health nurse started making her monthly visits 2 years prior. The world beyond these mountains existed to him only in stories passed down from grandparents who themselves had rarely ventured past the county line. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Ezra led Whitfield up a narrow path that wound between the cabins, each structure seeming to lean toward its neighbors as if drawing comfort from proximity. The doctor counted individuals as they passed, noting with growing unease the physical similarities that linked them all, the diminutive stature, the unusually large eyes set in narrow faces, the delicate bone structure that gave them an almost ethereal appearance. He counted 17 people in those first few minutes, ranging in apparent age from early childhood to what must have been advanced years, though the weathered faces made precise estimation difficult. What struck him most was not their shared features, but the way they moved together, a choreography of glances and gestures that suggested communication occurring on frequencies he could not perceive. The patriarch of the family, a man named Jeremiah Dahl who claimed to be 78, received Whitfield in the largest cabin at the top of the hollow. The interior was dim, lit only by the fire in the hearth and a single kerosene lamp that cast dancing shadows across walls hung with dried herbs and faded photographs. Jeremiah sat in a rocking chair that creaked with each subtle movement, his frame so slight that the chair seemed built for a much larger occupant. His eyes, those same enormous eyes that marked every family member, fixed upon the doctor with an intensity that suggested decades of accumulated weariness toward outsiders. "They've been sending people up here for years," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying the rasp of advanced age. "Preachers wanting to save our souls, government men wanting to count our heads. What do you want, doctor?" Whitfield chose his words carefully. He explained that he was interested in family histories, in understanding how generations of mountain families had maintained their health in such isolated conditions. He made no mention of the reports that had actually brought him here, the descriptions of cognitive delays, of children born with conditions their parents could not name, of a family tree so tangled that the same names appeared as both ancestors and descendants within living memory. These were conversations for later, once trust had been established, if trust could be established at all. What Whitfield learned in that first meeting would form the foundation of a case study that would eventually reach the desks of geneticists across the country. The Dahl family, Jeremiah explained with a matter-of-factness that suggested he saw nothing unusual in the telling, had occupied this hollow since 1832. The original settlers had been a brother and sister, Jacob and Sarah Dahl, who had traveled from Virginia with their parents as children and remained after both parents succumbed to fever during the journey. They had married each other, as was not uncommon in frontier communities where potential spouses were scarce, and had produced 11 children who survived to adulthood. Those children had married among themselves and with the offspring of 2 neighboring families who had joined the hollow in the years that followed. By 1870, the 3 original families had so thoroughly intermarried that distinguishing one bloodline from another had become impossible. The isolation, Jeremiah continued, had been both chosen and imposed. Chosen because the outside world had never offered them anything worth leaving the mountains for. Imposed because the outside world, when it occasionally ventured into their hollow, had never treated them as equals. The Dahl family had been called many things over the decades: simple, touched, cursed, blessed with the innocence of children. They had learned early that interaction with outsiders brought nothing but judgment, and so they had retreated further into themselves, into their hollow, into the only world where they were simply family. As darkness fell over Pigeon Creek that first evening, Whitfield sat by the fire in Jeremiah's cabin and began to understand the true scope of what he had discovered. This was not simply a family that had intermarried. This was a closed genetic population that had been reproducing within itself for over 120 years. Nearly 6 generations of unions between relatives of varying degrees of closeness. The physical characteristics he observed, the small stature, the distinctive facial features, the developmental differences that marked several family members, these were not anomalies, but the predictable outcome of such sustained biological isolation. The Dahl family was living evidence of genetic principles that most textbooks discussed only in theoretical terms. But Whitfield was not merely a scientist collecting data. He was also a man. And as he looked around that cabin at the faces illuminated by firelight, he saw not specimens, but people. People who had lived their entire lives in this hollow, who had loved and worked and mourned and celebrated in ways that the outside world would never understand. People who were about to have their lives documented, analyzed, and filed away in government reports that would reduce their existence to a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation. The ethical implications of what he was doing, of what he was about to uncover, would haunt him for the rest of his career. That night, as Whitfield lay in the small bed Jeremiah had offered him in an unused cabin, he could hear voices drifting through the hollow. The Dahl family was talking among themselves, their words indistinct but their tone unmistakable. They were discussing him, the stranger who had arrived with questions and a briefcase full of forms. They were deciding, through whatever process of collective deliberation they had developed over generations of shared existence, whether to trust him with their stories. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Whitfield understood that the next few days would determine whether he would leave this hollow with the cooperation of its inhabitants or with only the superficial observations of an unwelcome visitor. He had no way of knowing that the stories they would eventually share, the truths they would eventually reveal, would change not only his understanding of human heredity but his understanding of what it meant to be a family. The morning brought fog so thick that Whitfield could barely see the cabin next to his own. Sound traveled strangely in such conditions, amplified and distorted, so that conversation seemed to occur both very close and impossibly far away simultaneously. He dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Ezra waiting for him, that strange adult child figure who had first greeted him the day before. Ezra carried 2 cups of something that steamed in the cold air, and he offered one to the doctor without speaking. The beverage was some kind of herbal tea, bitter and unfamiliar but warming. Whitfield drank gratefully, and Ezra watched him with those enormous eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. "Grandpa Jeremiah says you can stay," Ezra finally said. "He says you're not like the others who came before. He says you look at us like we're people." Whitfield felt something catch in his throat, and it was not the tea. "You are people." Ezra's smile was knowing, sad, ancient in a face that looked perpetually young. "Not everyone thinks so, Doctor. Not everyone who comes here from out there." He gestured vaguely toward the mountains that separated the hollow from the wider world. "Some of them look at us like we're animals in a zoo. Some of them look at us like we're mistakes. You don't look at us like that." It was in that moment that Whitfield made a decision that would define the rest of his investigation. He would not treat the Dahl family as subjects to be studied. He would treat them as historians of their own experience, as experts in a way of life that no outsider could fully comprehend. He would listen before he questioned. He would learn before he judged. And he would write their story in a way that honored their humanity, even as it documented their genetic isolation. What he discovered over the following weeks would indeed rewrite history, though not in the way his supervisors in Louisville had anticipated. The Dahl family was not simply a genetic anomaly. They were a mirror held up to American society, reflecting back the consequences of policies and prejudices that had pushed certain communities to the margins and then forgotten them there. Their story was not just about blood and genes. It was about poverty and isolation, about the failure of institutions to reach those most in need, about the choices people make when the world offers them no good options. To understand how the Dahl family came to exist in their particular form of genetic isolation, Whitfield realized he needed to understand the history of the hollow itself. The story that Jeremiah and the older family members gradually revealed over cups of bitter tea and long evenings by the fire was not simply a tale of biological inheritance. It was a chronicle of social and economic forces that had conspired to create one of the most isolated communities in American history. The original settlers, Jacob and Sarah Dahl, had arrived in the Kentucky mountains in 1832 as part of a wave of migration from the Virginia Piedmont. Their parents, Heinrich and Martha Dahl, had been German immigrants who had come to America in 1818 seeking religious freedom and economic opportunity. They had found neither. Heinrich's particular brand of Protestant faith had been unwelcome in the established churches of Virginia, and his attempts to farm the exhausted tobacco lands of the Tidewater had ended in debt and desperation. When news reached the coast of cheap land available in the Kentucky Territory, Heinrich had loaded his family into a wagon and headed west. The journey had been devastating. Martha had died of fever 3 weeks into the trek, and Heinrich had followed her into the grave less than a month later, leaving 12-year-old Jacob and 10-year-old Sarah orphaned in the middle of the wilderness. The children had been taken in by a traveling Methodist minister heading toward the Cumberland Gap, and he had deposited them in the first settlement that agreed to accept them. That settlement was Letcher County, and the family that agreed to take them in, a childless couple named Whitaker who farmed a small plot near what would become Pigeon Creek, would inadvertently set in motion the genetic isolation that would define the Dahl family for generations to come. Jacob and Sarah grew up as virtual siblings in the Whitaker household, but their bond was always something more. They had survived the death of their parents together, had endured the uncertainty of being passed from stranger to stranger, had clung to each other as the only constant in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. When Jacob turned 18 and Sarah 16, they announced their intention to marry. The Whitakers, who had never legally adopted the children and thus had no authority to forbid the union, could only watch as the two young people walked to the county seat and obtained a marriage license that would have been denied in more populated areas. The marriage of Jacob and Sarah Dahl was not as unusual for its time and place as later generations would assume. In the remote hollows of Appalachia, where communities might consist of only a handful of families and travel to neighboring settlements could take days, marriages between relatives were relatively common. First cousins married with regularity, and unions between more distant relations were so common as to barely merit comment. What made the Dahl marriage different was the complete lack of genetic diversity it introduced into their offspring. Jacob and Sarah shared not only the same parents but the same limited genetic heritage of their immigrant family. Their children would inherit 2 copies of whatever recessive traits the Dahl bloodline carried. Those first 11 children who survived to adulthood appeared healthy enough by the standards of the time. The mountains were harsh on everyone, and distinguishing between congenital conditions and the effects of poor nutrition, inadequate shelter, and limited medical care was nearly impossible. But photographs that survived from the 1860s, which Jeremiah showed to Whitfield with trembling hands, revealed the first hints of what was to come. The Dahl children were noticeably smaller than their neighbors. Their features had a uniformity that seemed to go beyond normal family resemblance, and in several of the photographs, the photographer had captured a look in their eyes that suggested something not quite typical, though whether that something was cognitive or simply the weariness of people unused to having their images captured, no one could say with certainty. The second generation compounded the genetic isolation. By the 1850s, 2 other families had established homesteads in the hollow, the Couch family and the Sloan family. Both had arrived as single families, seeking isolation from various troubles that had made them unwelcome in more settled communities. The Couches were rumored to have fled Virginia after a violent dispute over land boundaries. The Sloans were said to have come from Tennessee to escape debts that could never be repaid. Whatever their origins, both families brought their own limited genetic diversity to the hollow. And within a generation, all 3 bloodlines had become so intertwined that separating them was impossible. The marriage records that Whitfield eventually obtained from the Letcher County Courthouse told a story of genetic narrowing that accelerated with each generation. In the 1850s and 60s, the pattern was already established. A Dahl would marry a Couch son, their daughter would marry a Sloan boy, and that couple's son would marry back into the Dahl family. By the 1880s, the county clerk had noted in the margins of several marriage certificates that the couples appeared to be close relatives, though he had no authority to refuse the licenses. By the 1910s, the clerk had stopped making such notations, either because the situation had become too common to merit comment or because he had given up trying to track the increasingly complex relationships. The physical consequences of this genetic isolation began to manifest more clearly in the 4th and 5th generations. Whitfield interviewed surviving members of these generations, men and women in their 60s and 70s who remembered growing up in a community where certain conditions were simply accepted as the way things were. They spoke of siblings who had never learned to speak clearly, of cousins who could not walk without assistance, of aunts and uncles who had the bodies of adults but the minds of young children. They spoke of these things not with shame, but with the matter-of-factness of people describing the weather. This was simply their reality, the only reality they had ever known. One of the most striking figures from this generation was a woman named Delilah Dahl, Jeremiah's own mother, who had died in 1945 at the age of 72. Delilah had been born in 1873, the daughter of first cousins who were themselves the children of the original sibling marriage. By any genetic calculation, her coefficient of inbreeding was extraordinarily high. And yet she had lived a long and remarkably productive life by the standards of the hollow. She had borne 14 children, of whom 8 had survived to adulthood. She had served as the unofficial midwife for the entire community, delivering every baby born in the hollow for nearly 50 years, and she had maintained an oral history of the family that she passed down to her children and grandchildren, a chronicle of names and relationships that allowed the Dahl family to keep track of their complex genealogy even when written records failed. It was Delilah who had first noticed the pattern that Whitfield would later document in his research. She had observed that certain unions produced healthier children than others, and she had quietly steered the younger generation toward marriages that maximized whatever genetic diversity remained in the hollow. She could not have explained her reasoning in scientific terms, but her instincts were sound. The children of couples she had approved tended to be stronger, healthier, more likely to survive to adulthood. The children of couples who had ignored her advice, who had married partners too closely related even by the hollow's standards, often did not survive their first year. Whitfield spent 3 days with Jeremiah reconstructing the family tree from Delilah's oral history and the fragmentary written records that had survived. What emerged was a document unlike anything he had encountered in his years of genetic research. The tree did not branch outward like a normal family genealogy. Instead, it folded back upon itself repeatedly, with the same names appearing in multiple positions across generations. A man might be simultaneously someone's uncle and cousin. A woman might be her own great-aunt through a different line of descent. The mathematics of inheritance, which normally diluted shared genetic material with each generation, had instead concentrated it, producing a population that was genetically closer to siblings than to the distant cousins they would have been in any normal community. The health consequences of this concentration were written in the bodies of the family members Whitfield examined during his stay. He documented conditions that ranged from relatively minor, such as unusual dental formations and mild hearing loss, to profoundly life-altering. Several family members exhibited the distinctive features that had earned them the Dahl nickname, small stature combined with proportionally large heads and eyes, giving them an appearance that outsiders found unsettling. Others showed signs of metabolic conditions that had likely shortened the lives of previous generations. Still others exhibited cognitive differences that ranged from mild learning difficulties to profound developmental delays. But Whitfield also documented something that his superiors in Louisville had not expected and did not know how to interpret. Despite the obvious genetic burden they carried, the Dahl family had developed remarkable adaptations to their circumstances. They had created a community structure that supported its most vulnerable members, ensuring that no one went hungry or unhoused regardless of their ability to contribute economically. They had developed specialized skills that took advantage of their particular physical characteristics, with the smaller family members excelling at tasks like crawling into narrow mine shafts or climbing trees to harvest nuts and fruits. They had maintained social cohesion and mutual support across generations in ways that many normal communities had long since abandoned. The Dahl family's isolation began to crack in the 1920s when the coal companies came to eastern Kentucky with their promises of employment and their appetite for land. The hollow itself contained no coal worth mining, but the roads that the companies built to access more valuable seams passed within a few miles of Pigeon Creek. For the first time in nearly a century, the outside world had a way to reach the hollow that did not require days of travel on foot or horseback. The first outsiders to take advantage of this access were not doctors or social workers, but photographers and journalists who had heard rumors of the strange little people living in the mountains. The 1920s were a time of great public fascination with human oddities, and the Dahl family, with their distinctive appearance and mysterious isolation, seemed perfect subjects for sensationalized newspaper stories. Several articles appeared in regional papers describing the Dahl people of Kentucky in terms that ranged from patronizing to openly derisive. The family was described variously as throwbacks to an earlier stage of human evolution, as victims of some mountain curse, and as evidence of the degeneracy that isolation and poverty produced. These articles brought more visitors, some curious and some cruel. Jeremiah remembered being a young man in the 1930s when carloads of strangers would sometimes appear at the edge of the hollow, gawking at the family members as if they were exhibits in a traveling show. Some visitors threw coins as if the family were beggars performing for entertainment. Others took photographs without permission, images that would later appear in academic texts and popular magazines alike, always without the family's consent or compensation. A few visitors were actively hostile, shouting insults or throwing rocks at family members who ventured too close to the road. The family's response to this invasion was to retreat further into themselves. They developed systems for detecting approaching strangers and warning the community. They established protocols for interaction that minimized contact while avoiding the outright hostility that might bring official attention. And they learned to present a carefully curated version of themselves to outsiders, hiding their most vulnerable members and downplaying the true extent of their genetic isolation. By the time Whitfield arrived in 1958, the family had nearly 3 decades of experience in managing outside attention, which explained their initial wariness toward yet another stranger with questions. The 1940s brought new challenges in the form of government programs designed to modernize rural Appalachia. Social workers began making regular visits to the region, assessing families for everything from nutritional deficiencies to educational needs. The Dahl family was identified early as a population of concern, and several attempts were made to intervene in their lives. Children were removed from the hollow and placed in schools in the county seat, where they struggled with curricula designed for students with very different backgrounds and abilities. Adults were pressured to accept employment in the coal mines or factories that were beginning to dot the region, despite their unsuitability for such work. And throughout the decade, there were persistent rumors that some officials wanted to relocate the entire family, scattering them across the state to dilute what one health department memo described as their defective germplasm. The family resisted these interventions with quiet determination. Children sent to outside schools would return to the hollow at the first opportunity, preferring the familiar environment of their community to the hostile confusion of mainstream education. Adults who took jobs in the outside world rarely lasted more than a few months before returning to the only home they had ever known. And when officials came to discuss relocation, they were met with a united front of refusal that eventually exhausted the government's patience. By the early 1950s, the Dahl family had been largely forgotten by the bureaucracies that had once taken such interest in them, left to continue their isolated existence in their forgotten hollow. Whitfield's research in the hollow lasted 6 weeks in the fall of 1958, followed by 2 additional visits in 1959 and 1960. During that time, he conducted extensive medical examinations of willing family members, documented their genealogy in unprecedented detail, and collected biological samples that would be analyzed in laboratories across the country. What he found confirmed many of his initial suspicions while also revealing complexities that challenged the prevailing scientific understanding of human genetics. The family exhibited a range of inherited conditions that could be traced directly to their genetic isolation. Whitfield documented hearing impairments in nearly 40% of family members, dental abnormalities in over 60%, and various metabolic conditions that affected at least a quarter of the population. The distinctive physical features that had given the family their nickname, the small stature and large eyes, appeared to be the result of multiple genes interacting in ways that were still poorly understood. And the cognitive differences that affected some family members ranged from mild to profound, though Whitfield was careful to note that distinguishing genetic effects from the impacts of poverty, malnutrition, and lack of formal education was extremely difficult. But the most significant finding was not medical, but social. Whitfield observed that the family had developed what he termed an integrated support system that ensured the survival and care of all members regardless of their individual capabilities. Those who could work did so, sharing the products of their labor with those who could not. Those who could not perform physical labor contributed in other ways, watching children, preparing food, maintaining the oral histories that connected generations. The family functioned as a single economic and social unit, with resources flowing to wherever they were most needed at any given time. This system, Whitfield argued, explained how a population with such significant genetic challenges had managed to survive and even thrive for over a century in one of the most unforgiving environments in America. The publication of Whitfield's research in 1962 caused a sensation in genetic and anthropological circles. His detailed documentation of the Dahl family's genealogy and medical conditions provided invaluable data for scientists studying the effects of inbreeding in human populations. His photographs, taken with the family's permission and featuring subjects who had agreed to be identified, appeared in textbooks and academic journals for decades afterward. And his arguments about the social adaptations the family had developed sparked debates about the relationship between genetics and culture that continue to this day. But the research also brought consequences that Whitfield had not anticipated and could not control. The publicity surrounding his publications renewed outside interest in the Hollow, bringing a new wave of visitors, researchers, and officials who wanted to study, help, or transform the family. New programs were implemented with varying degrees of success and failure. Children were again placed in outside schools, and this time some of them stayed, building lives in the wider world that their ancestors had never known. Young adults began leaving the Hollow in search of opportunities that the mountains could not provide. And slowly, inexorably, the population of Pigeon Creek began to decline. By 1975, when Whitfield made his final visit to the Hollow, the community that had once numbered over 50 people had dwindled to fewer than 20. Jeremiah had died in 1968 at what he claimed was the age of 88, though birth records that might have confirmed this had long since been lost. Ezra had surprised everyone by leaving the Hollow in 1965 to work in a factory in Lexington, where he had married a woman who knew nothing of his family's history. Several other young people had followed similar paths, dispersing into the broader American population and diluting the genetic concentration that had defined their ancestors. Those who remained were primarily the older generation and those whose conditions made survival in the outside world difficult or impossible. They continued to live as their ancestors had lived, farming small plots of land, hunting and gathering in the surrounding forests, and maintaining the traditions that had sustained them through more than a century of isolation. But they knew, even if they did not speak of it openly, that their community was dying. The young people who left rarely returned except for occasional visits. The children who remained rarely had children of their own. The Hollow was emptying, and when the last of the old generation passed, there would be no one left to remember what had been. Whitfield sat with the surviving family members during that final visit and listened as they reflected on the changes they had witnessed. They spoke of grandparents who had never seen an automobile, of parents who had never used electricity, of childhood spent in a world that had seemed permanent and timeless but had proven as fragile as mountain mist. They spoke of siblings and cousins who had left for the cities and never returned, who had changed their names and hidden their origins and built new identities that had nothing to do with the Hollow where they had been born. They spoke of the loneliness of being left behind, of being the ones who stayed when everyone else had gone. But they also spoke of pride. Pride in having survived when the outside world had predicted their extinction. Pride in having maintained their community for as long as they had against odds that should have been insurmountable. Pride in the family bonds that had held them together through poverty and prejudice and the slow erosion of their isolation. Whatever else the world might say about the Dahl family of Pigeon Creek, they had endured. They had lived and loved and passed their stories down through generations. They had been, in their own way, a success. The last permanent resident of Pigeon Creek died in 1983. Her name was Mabel Dahl, and she had been born in the Hollow in 1903. The great-great-granddaughter of Jacob and Sarah, she had lived her entire 80 years within walking distance of the cabin where she had been born. Had never traveled more than 20 miles from the Hollow in her life. Had witnessed the rise and fall of a community that had existed for a century and a half before fading into history. When she died, she was buried in the small cemetery on the hillside above the Hollow, joining the dozens of ancestors who had preceded her. The cabin where she had lived, the last occupied structure in Pigeon Creek, was left to slowly collapse under the weight of mountain winters. Today, the Hollow is largely reclaimed by the forest. The cabins that once housed the Dahl family have fallen into ruin, their logs rotting beneath blankets of kudzu and Virginia creeper. The cemetery is still there, its headstones tilting at angles that make the inscriptions difficult to read, the names of the forgotten dead slowly fading as lichen spreads across the carved letters. Occasionally, a historian or genealogist will make the difficult journey up the creek bed to stand among the ruins and try to imagine the lives that were lived there. But for the most part, Pigeon Creek has returned to the silence that preceded human habitation, a hollow in the mountains that keeps its secrets close. The descendants of the Dahl family are scattered now across the country. Their blood diluted through generations of marriage outside the community. Most do not know their origins, do not carry the name that once marked their ancestors as different, do not exhibit the physical characteristics that once made their family objects of fascination and fear. They are teachers and truck drivers, nurses and factory workers, indistinguishable from the millions of other Americans who go about their daily lives without knowing the strange histories their ancestors carried. The genetic concentration that once defined the family has been dispersed into the broader human gene pool, a few drops of mountain water lost in an endless ocean. But in archives and libraries across the country, the story of the Dahl family survives. Whitfield's research papers, now considered classics in the field of human genetics, continue to be cited by scientists studying the effects of genetic isolation. The photographs he took, showing faces that seem to belong to another era entirely, appear in documentaries and academic texts as evidence of a chapter in American history that most people never knew existed. And the lessons learned from Pigeon Creek about the consequences of isolation and the remarkable adaptability of human communities continue to inform discussions about genetics, society, and the hidden populations that exist at the margins of every civilization. What they found in Appalachia in 1958 did indeed rewrite history. Not just the history of a single family, but the history of America itself, revealing how easily certain communities could be forgotten, how thoroughly they could be ignored, and how much could be lost when the outside world finally noticed them too late to save what they had built. The Dahl family of Pigeon Creek was not a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation. They were a testament to the human capacity for survival against impossible odds. A community that had created its own world when the larger world had no place for them. And perhaps that is the most important lesson their story has to offer. In a nation that prides itself on opportunity and mobility, the Dahl family reminds us that not everyone has access to those promises. Some are left behind, forgotten in hollows and valleys and remote corners where the light of progress never reaches. Some build their own communities, develop their own adaptations, create their own definitions of success and failure. And when we finally discover them, we should approach not with judgment or pity, but with the humility to recognize that their way of life, however different from our own, has its own validity, its own wisdom, its own beauty. They found the Dahl family of Appalachia in 1958, and what they said rewrote history. But the true history is not what the scientists documented in their papers or what the journalists described in their articles. The true history is what happened in that hollow for 150 years, the lives lived and the love shared and the community maintained against all odds. That history belongs to the Dahl family themselves, to the descendants who carry their blood without knowing it, and to everyone who takes the time to remember that America has always contained multitudes, some of them hiding in plain sight in the folds of the mountains, waiting to be discovered.